Hi, I'm Meta Spencer, and today we're going to go to Cornell University and we're going to get our hands dirty. We're going to work in the soil, at least vicariously, with a professor there who makes his whole career a study of how to improve the quality of the soil. And the more we learn about the soil, the more we realize how important it is to get it right, because there are a lot of things going on in there that we hadn't paid attention to. And so this is Professor Johannes Lehmann, who is this is going to be a mouthful, a long title. Liberty Hyde Bailey Professor, School of Integrated Plant Science, Soil and Crop Sciences Section, Liberty Hyde Bailey Professor, Department of Global Development. I don't know which of those you use, but I bet you don't say that every day of the week, that whole thing. Good morning, Professor Lehmann. It's good to meet you.
Thank you very much for hosting me. I look forward to the conversation.
Well, I've heard your name or run across it for about 5 years now, because I've been, once ran across an article in a magazine about something called terra preta. And I found that the Indians in South America had been doing things thousands of years ago that we should try to emulate today. And that you have written books about it and have studied it, and you are the foremost authority on what is not called terra preta among academics, but I believe biochar. Is that right?
I do enjoy thinking about how traditional and ancient soil management has something to teach us today. And while I would step away a little bit from emulate and copy, I definitely think it's inspirational. And the question is, what kind of lessons can we learn from traditional soil management, where we see the results still today after thousands of years?
How did you come to this study?
Serendipitously, as most research, I guess. I had no intention to study terra preta in the Amazon, but I happened to be on a postdoc or a research coordinator position in the Central Amazon, funded by the German Ministry of International Cooperation, and working at what's called Embrapa, which is a agricultural research organization of Brazil. And I was working on agroforestry, tree crop agroforestry, where we planted different trees together, nut trees and annatto trees and palm trees, and looked at how we can combine different crops to reduce nutrient and water losses, to improve the soil health of these degraded landscapes after deforestation. And then I couldn't help but noticing these very fertile soils that are peppered throughout the landscape, and that some of my colleagues had already started to investigate a few years earlier. And the results of these studies were that a critical ingredient of these soils was what we at the time called charcoal or black carbon or pyrogenic carbon, the remnants of charring or fires. And that lesson, I think, was a critical lesson, although there are many other lessons that we can learn from these soils. It's by far not the only one. That was a lesson, and that was inspirational to me, so that we started to install greenhouse and field trials in the Central Amazon to study directly what charcoal additions do to soil fertility, and that charcoal, that agricultural charcoal, was then 10 years later coined biochar to clearly distinguish it from charcoal made for energy consumption. So that was my foray in the late 90s into this topic.
So you weren't exactly the first person to get curious about it, but you were early on. in the research. Well, is there more research still going on there, or mostly nowadays do you do everything you need to do in your own lab here in North America?
Unfortunately, I don't do myself any research in Brazil at the moment. I do mostly research in the lab and around New York. I would like to continue more research in sub-Saharan Africa, where I have done a lot of research on biochar over the decades, but COVID-related, that is at the moment more difficult than one wishes to. But there are definitely colleagues, Brazilian colleagues and other colleagues that are very active in the central Amazon to study both the Terra preta that is there, as well as to investigate some lessons that we can learn, whether it's about the charcoal, biochar type material that is in these soils, but also many other lessons that we might learn from those soils. So there are quite a few aspects.
Is there anything comparable in Africa? I mean, the Africans had also discovered biochar, I gather.
That's a good question. We actually find what we call African dark earths, where the story, at least the biogeochemical evidence that we can measure today, is remarkably similar to the evidence in the central Amazon. We find very fertile, very dark soils that are very deep, that have been enriched with biochar and other materials, and that are valued for their soil fertility, that villagers are expressing interest in those soils and have also creation stories about those soils. And some say, no, it's made from God and given to people. Others say, yeah, we actually know how this works. Interestingly, the African dark earths that we have documented are those that we found are by and large more recent than the ones in the central Amazon. I have not worked on any Terra preta soils in the central Amazon that are younger than about 400, 500 years before present. But I know that others have argued that there are more recent ones around. They're just not very numerous, whereas we have hardly found any soils where the carbon is older than 500 years in these African dark earths. So it fills a critical gap in our understanding about the sustainability of those kind of soils and that those kind of soil amendments, if you want to call it that, although there is still a lot of debate, and there must be a lot of variation in how these soils came about. Some might have come about indeed as a result of deliberate soil management with an intended agricultural use in mind, whereas others are just trash middens that were never supposed to be an agricultural field. I think both conclusions are valid for different situations in the landscape as far as we know now.
But the South American Terra preta is older on the whole. How old does it go back to?
There's also some debates, and that's really in the realm of archaeologists. I do have some soils where the C14 ages are supposedly going up to 8,000 years before present. But the majority is around 2,000 to 3,000 years before present, when agriculture really took off in the central Amazon. Before 2,000 to 3,000 to 4,000 years before present, apparently populations were dominated by hunter-gatherers, and seed evidence is for agricultural crops that are supposedly planted are only found about 2,000 to 3,000 years before present, if I remember correctly what my archaeology colleagues have found. But this is very thinly researched. There are just very few groups that are doing this kind of research, and I don't do that research myself, but it seems a very arduous research that archaeologists do and to excavate individual sites compared to how we usually work with a hammer and an auger going through the landscape and taking soil samples.
What was surprising about it?
Yeah, so these terra preta soils, they are, as I mentioned, they're very dark, whereas the natural soils, if you might call it, so the typical soils in the central Amazon are light brown to reddish to whitish. And the dark color is typically interpreted in many soils, although there are many notable exceptions, is interpreted as being carbon rich and fertile. So these soils indeed are dark. These terra preta soils are dark because they typically have high organic matter contents that reach down into the soil profile much deeper than a typical soil. Whereas a typical soil would have organic matter accumulation in the first 5 to 15 centimeters. These soils can be 1, 2, 3 meters deep. So way more than I'm tall, having enrichment and are pitch dark. And that coloration is a result of organic matter. And what is more, it's the result of a specific kind of organic matter, which we now call biochar in the context of a soil amendment, and which landscape ecologists and biogeochemists call pyrogenic carbon. So the remnant of some kind of fire or charring process. And the chemistry of a biological carbon, whether it's a microbe, a microbial residue, a piece of leaf, excreta from animals or humans, compared to when you char any of those that I just mentioned, is fundamental. Those differences, the chemistry of that material changes fundamental, and we can measure that. The basic mechanism is, as we know from charcoal making is one of the oldest industrial processes that humanity has developed. In the Iron Age, we wouldn't have the Iron Age without charcoal, and charcoal making is the process of heating organic matter in the absence of air, or in the absence of oxygen, to be more precise, and that leads to pyrolysis that fuses carbon atoms together rather than burns them. Burning in an open flame is a process with a lot of oxygen that leaves behind ash, whereas charring without oxygen leaves behind char and some gases that have a much greater molecular weight and energy content than carbon dioxide and water. That's the result of burning. So the difference between charring and burning is very important.
These things that you buy in the supermarket for barbecue, these are charcoal lumps or something. They've taken wood and they have cooked it in the absence of oxygen, right?
Correct.
And so I've never actually done barbecuing. I'm not even sure what happens, but those things will burn, and hold the heat. And why do they use that for cooking? And what's the relationship between those charcoal lumps for barbecuing and terra preta?
Yeah, so those charcoal lumps that you can buy in the supermarket for barbecue is made exactly with that process that we just discussed, and that can be used as an energy source. We can light a charcoal and then it burns and releases heat. Most of the energy from a piece of wood that is made into a piece of charcoal is in that charcoal. Some of it is released, actually a little less than half is released during charcoal making. The other half is in that piece of charcoal. And that can be used as an energy carrier in your barbecue, as we all know. In a biochar system, or with the idea of adding biochar to soil, you would add that material to soil. most of the or all of the charcoals that are made for barbecue or in general as an energy carrier are, of course, optimized to burn well and not to be a good soil amendment. But in principle, many of the charcoals that one can buy as an ingredient for barbecue might be a perfectly appropriate soil amendment as well. But not all of them. Some of them might be really good for making a fire and roasting your chicken, but might make very bad soil amendments. And then there are a lot of biochars that make superb soil amendments, but do not burn at all. And so that was a motivation to say we need two different names for the two, because they might be made very similarly or identically, but they serve dramatically different purposes and are therefore optimized in different ways.
How did the people in South America make their biochar? And did they do it with the intention of making rich soil, or was this a byproduct of something else that they were doing for some other reason?
Yeah, and that's been a big debate. Obviously, we cannot ask anyone who lived 500 years ago or 2,000 years ago, and there's no written record. So there's literally no way of getting direct information. So the opportunity that we have is looking at the archaeological context that we find soils today and make inferences about could this have been an intentional amendment or not, or were they making biochar here in this location and then transporting it somewhere else where it was needed as a soil amendment. If you would find it at the same place where it was produced, then you might make the inference, well, this is not really clear. It could be just a trash. It could be a dustbin for fires or for charcoal making for energy. And these are the remnants of charcoal making. This is not a deliberate amendment for improving soils. But then there are archaeological contexts where actually we find charcoal enriched or biochar type enriched soils outside defensive walls, where now archaeologists are showing us these are defensive walls. Habitation occurred inside, and outside, if we find biochar enriched fields widespread that we know are agricultural fields, that is a very good indication that these were deliberate additions to improve soils, because otherwise you would not risk of getting speared by your neighbor to walk with your biochar outside the defensive wall and enrich soils. Then you would just throw it down into the river, which they also do. So those are the kind of situational, location-specific interpretations that one can make. And the question is, do we find maybe still contemporary traditional soil management that gives us some clues? And there's very little that I know of. Some were described by Susanna Hecht from UCLA at the Kayapó population in central Brazil. And she describes what she calls cool burning, that populations that she had observed some decades ago were heaping up in the field crop residues, lighting it and covering it with soil to make charcoal, but not charcoal that can be burned in a stove to make energy, but charcoal that is then distributed in the field by just raking it in. So those kind of observations of contemporary management in populations now might give us an indication of what might have happened hundreds and thousands of years ago. But there's very little research in these populations, so that is a big constraint.
Let me ask you about this procedure of burning it in the fields, because it occurs to me that, there is this problem of people doing slash and burn agriculture, which I gather is not good for the environment at all, and certainly emits a lot of carbon into the atmosphere. So I believe people would like to get people to stop doing that. But what do they do? Is this a possible way of burning residue from crops without emitting a lot of carbon? Do they? Could you actually set fire to something but cover it with soil and smother the smoke so that it would not emit as much carbon to the atmosphere? Or I'm just fantasizing what this would be like.
That's what it would be like. Yeah, so that is actually what charcoal making in many populations around the world is, whether it's Asia, Africa, South America, Canada as well, is you're piling up organic matter. If you want to use this material as charcoal for energy in a barbecue, you would typically use wood. But you can also use grass if you have the right equipment. It doesn't have as much energy content in it, but if you have wood, you would probably like to use that. And that wood is piled up. And then the cheapest version is to just put soil on top, a little bit straw and soil, and then light the wood. But you can also pile up crop residues, straw, grasses, leaves, and do the same thing. Rice husks, rice straw, you name it. You could pile that up, cover it lightly with soil and light it up. And that would largely prevent burning, and it would promote charring. And the difference between burning, which is a flame with excess oxygen, and charring, which is no flame and no oxygen or very little oxygen, is that with burning, you burn all the carbon or most of it, not 95%, 98% of the carbon becomes CO2. Whereas with charring, only about half or less of the carbon becomes CO2. So back to your question, yes, when you switch from burning a vegetation to charring a vegetation, then you are reducing the carbon losses from 98% losses of carbon to 50 or 40% losses of carbon. So it's a dramatic change in carbon emission. That said, there are, of course, other emissions that are concomitant, such as methane, black carbon, or aerosol carbon, or nitrous oxide. And those are not always clear that with very cheap and unregulated charring methods that we don't inadvertently increase those emissions. But with modern charring, which can include very cheap methods, just in a ditch or with very cheap kilns, those emissions can be dramatically reduced compared to burning.
But it would still not be the preferred way of disposing of things, because it's going to emit a lot of stuff anyhow, right? Now, what again?
That's a question.
Another train of thought. I remember a few years ago, there was a huge fire in Russia of peat. Once you start a fire underground in the peat, it's really hard to put it out. And they have hundreds of miles, well, thousands, I guess, of peat. But that actually did emit a lot of smoke. I know Russians that really couldn't even stay in their houses because it was so bad. Tell me how that is compared to making charcoal, because if they're burning stuff underground, probably not all of that smoke is coming out, right? But it still sounds pretty bad.
Yeah, no, that there will be the conversion of that plant matter into charcoal is probably much greater than if it was burning above ground. You're absolutely right. The question what the net effect on greenhouse gases is always the first question is, what's the baseline? Now, what would happen if you don't do anything? And with burning, you emit everything, or 98%, and you're emitting methane and nitrous oxide. So if burning is your baseline, then charring is a dramatic reduction of emissions. if your baseline is the peat is still there in 100 years and the tree is still there in 100 years in Russia, then no charring will help you in reduce emissions. So if you have a carbon organic biomass resource that is still there in 100 years or in 50 years, you don't want to touch it. But if that tree is killed by pine bark beetles in British Columbia and would be needed to burn to eradicate the pine bark beetle, then instead of burning, charring is a good idea. Even though you still emit CO2 and methane with charring, you emit a lot less. So moving from slash and burn to slash and char, charring instead of burning is a dramatic reduction in emissions. Mm-hmm. Not touching the forest might be the best thing, but then also people can't live.
Okay, well, I'm glad you mentioned this pine bark beetle thing, because I had a big moment driving about 10 years ago. I drove through Canada, through the Rockies, and I found hundreds of miles of red trees, pine trees and things that had been eaten by these beetles. And I came back with the idea that what the biggest contribution the government of Canada could make to the world would be to go cut those trees down and dig trenches right there, put these logs and decaying matter into the trenches and make biochar right there and just leave it. That this would be a reduction of, because what's going to happen is the trees lie there and rot, and then all of the carbon in them goes back into the atmosphere. But wouldn't it be better to make biochar of these things?
No, I think it's a very legitimate question, and the answer to that will depend on first the baseline. Is that even if the tree needs to be felled because of the pine bark beetle infestation, or is just falling on its own, does the decomposition of that tree stem, how long does that take? And when is there the break even point between charring that tree versus not charring that tree? Over long periods of time, it will be better to char that tree, because the charcoal, even though we emit half of the carbon right off the bat when you char it, that remaining biochar made from that tree will last a lot longer than the decomposing wood would. And so over long periods of time, it's a better idea to char that tree. How to finance that? That's the next question. Generating energy through that process. What do you do with that energy in the middle of the woods? You can't get it out. So that is in many situations not a good idea. Transporting the wood somewhere to a central station where you have an electric grid is a possibility, but how much transportation costs would that incur? Leaving the biochar right where you found it, as you seem to be suggesting, I think that's a good idea. And then one would need to figure out whether carbon markets are prepared to pay for that process, because that, even if you do it very, very low tech, it still incurs more costs than just felling a tree or letting it fall down. And so those are questions that need to be figured out. With some of the invasive species and pine bark beetle management, actually the trees have to be burned to make sure that the pine bark beetle is killed. So then somebody's already there with a flamethrower and burning that tree and has to do something. So that might be a situation where one could argue that instead of the forest workers burning heaps of pine bark beetle infested dead trees, they might start charring it, even if they don't do anything with the energy that is released, or they don't do anything with the biochar that is produced. The costs of managing by fire in some ways already incurred because you need to manage the pine bark beetle. Why not switch from burning to charring and sequester carbon? especially maybe if there is really a carbon market that is emerging slowly, ever so slowly, that could pay for at least some of it, or make that even completely doable, because the difference between charring and burning is what the carbon market can actually cover.
So they actually do burn some of these trees now anyway.
Yes, yes.
Okay. But here's another question. Now, as I understand it, the exciting thing about biochar is that it will, where other organic matter will decay and go send the carbon back into the atmosphere, and therefore this is a source of greenhouse gas. The beautiful thing about biochar is that it can stay there forever, practically thousands of years, and it will never get back into the atmosphere, or at least not within any foreseeable future. Now, tell me about the other forms of sequestering carbon in the soil. I've become interested in various kinds of regenerative agriculture, which, the argument is that you want to have crops that draw, of course, all plants capture carbon, but they put them in through the roots into the soil. And that with certain kinds of farming, you can just keep adding a certain amount every year so that the amount of carbon in your soil gets richer and richer. Now, I've heard it said that's up to a certain limit, that there's a certain saturation point. You can't just keep putting endless amounts of carbon into the soil through the use of the particular crops that you're growing, but eventually it'll get as much as it's going to hold. Well, you've just talked about 8-foot deep piles of biochar in the Amazon. So clearly, if you make it into biochar and then put it in your soil, or maybe on top of the soil, it can hold 6 feet deep for amounts of, there's no endless into the amount it could hold. Is that right?
It's limited by how much you can add to the soil to not deteriorate any other soil functions, which clearly, looking at this traditional soil management, if you care to describe them as such, is quite a lot. You're absolutely right. And so that saturation point that we assume, and I think correctly assume, and only imperfectly quantify and imperfectly understand, is not applicable for biochar. And for instance, also not for peatland restoration. We can have very big peatlands or tundras that have practically no saturation. We can pile a lot of peat on top of each other, and some peats are just a few centimeters, and some peats are meters deep. So here the difference is that with a lot of soil carbon sequestration techniques that people talk about, they operate by a retention of that carbon that is added to soil through, for instance, aggregation and interaction with minerals and other processes that we loosely call functional complexity, which must have a saturation and which do likely have a saturation. And what we manage there is really either increasing a little bit the input or reducing a little bit the output. Reducing the output is, for instance, done by reducing tillage. We till that less. Increasing the input is by, for instance, adding more compost, or having more crop residues retained, or having more plant cover and increasing input. And between the two, more input and less output, we're increasing the stocks. But that still is predicated on continuous input of, say, crop residues or manures or dying roots and root turnover in a grassland every year. When you stop the input, the stocks go down. Biochar is fundamentally different in this context because it is an input that then decomposes a lot slower than an uncharred organic matter would have, and so it's predicated on an input, but it's not a continuous input where you keep a stock up, where you just tweak the balance between input and output so that the stocks go a little higher. Here you add something, the stocks are high, and then very slowly it decreases. And you mentioned a number, mean residence times, which is still mean residence times, are very often in the hundreds to thousands of years or even longer. So that the decomposition rates are much, much slower than the uncharred organic matter at the same location would have been. And that is the difference in how the carbon stocks then increase. And you're absolutely right. This decomposition of biochar is not as dependent on these mechanism of interactions with mineral surfaces of the soil or aggregation of the soil or temperature and moisture as a leaf would have been or compost would have been, and so it's a fundamental difference. But if it helps, the analogy, even if it's sort of a little bit wonky, the analogy with peat or restored wetlands is not so off. Although of course peatlands are accruing carbon because it's wet and cold, not because of the material is inherently not decomposable. If a peatland is drained, then of course it decomposes very quickly or relatively quickly. Whereas with biochar, this is the material properties are key here, not the moisture of the soil. So in that sense, the comparison with wetland restoration is not quite fair. But in the context of your question of why does someone say there is a saturation when there are clearly some soil management where there isn't or not in the same way, then there are these several categories of soil carbon accrual that don't have the same saturation principle as our typical no-till or grassland restoration or manure additions or compost additions have.
Well, in another week or so, I'm going to do a talk show with Ed Struzik, who has a new book out about peat.
There we go.
Yeah. So I'll get a good briefing on that. But what I'm thinking is, my enthusiasm for biochar came when I began to be aware of the need to not only stop emitting carbon, which I think is unfortunately the only thing most people talk about when they talk about trying to reduce global warming, but the need to actually withdraw carbon from the atmosphere and lock it up someplace. And then it occurred to me that, well, my goodness, the best thing that we could do to take carbon out of the atmosphere would be to capture all of the cardboard boxes that Amazon is delivering to me, all of the other old clothes and all this junk that we are producing that contains carbon, but it's trash or it's going to be wasted. It's going to be returned to the atmosphere. Why don't we just make it into biochar and put it underground someplace?
The term technical potential that you used I think is a good starting point. And technical potential means, if there's no financial constraint, if we would start tomorrow and we would put all our effort in it, what could we achieve? And then put some constraints on it, so that we don't want to expand agricultural fields beyond what it is now. We want to have 60% of the crop residues still be on the soil surface to protect the soil from erosion, et cetera, et cetera. So we can put all those kinds of constraints that will make the number smaller and smaller and smaller. because we want to make sure that indigenous rights are respected, that no agricultural fields are converted into fast-growing willows, that we still have enough food, et cetera, et cetera. So if we do all of that, these are still technical constraints. Then we end up somewhere in the order of 3 to 6 petagrams of carbon dioxide equivalents, which means it's not as much as fossil fuel emissions annually, but it is in the order of magnitude of any other suggestion that has been put on the table to sequester carbon and reduce emissions. Or especially to reduce withdraws carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and so we definitely will not single-handedly stop climate change through adopting a global and very aggressive. Or when I say very aggressive, I still mean reducing it by all or putting constraints, a lot of sustainability constraints around it. We will not single-handedly resolve climate change. We still need a lot of tools in our tool basket from other technologies. And then you can ask the next question. So if we don't have a lot of money and we have to make decisions of what is better to do in a certain location, let's take Ithaca. And what should we do here on that slope versus the other slope? Should we do composting here or direct application of a feedstock? Or should we make biochar in New York City and transport the biochar then to upstate New York? How far can we transport it? And how much money do we have to spend anyways? So that these feasibility constraints that are social and economic in nature will, of course, again constrain any technology, whether it's wind energy or water or photovoltaics. And then one of the latest scientific papers that just came out 2 weeks ago by a large multi-author team showed that biochar is among the largest numbers in the agriculture sector, or is the largest number in the agriculture sector of carbon dioxide removal and greenhouse gas emission reductions that we can do. So it's a significant number, but it will not be the sole approach if we put all these constraints on it. Key for biochar to make a lot of sense and reduce emissions greater than just generating energy and reducing fossil fuel is that it has a soil effect, that when you add it to soil, that it reduces some kind of emissions, either because a plant grows more or nitrous oxide is reduced or methane is reduced. And that is not at every location of the world the case. And obviously, transportation distances play a role, and so on and so forth. So I unfortunately, a lot of the answers to that we will only know once we've embarked on a global approach to in earnest mitigate climate change. I do think that soil carbon sequestration, including biochar, but also without biochar, is in most cases a no regret strategy. Because even if we don't get to a globally significant number in aggregate, those farmers who have improved their soils through more soil organic matter and more biochar in their soils will have a benefit from that locally for their crop growth, for their water quality, even if it's only 1 petagram or half a petagram or only 10 teragram of reduced emissions globally.
Biochar is not a fertilizer, as I understand it, but it does make easier to grow big and healthy crops, which is what fertilizers do. What's the difference between the effect of adding biochar to your soil and the effect of adding fertilizer. Does it mean that you can use less fertilizer if you use biochar? And if so, why?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And what we do know right now is that increasing soil organic matter in the soil will improve, in most cases, up to a certain extent, crop growth. And one of the mechanisms that is credited to that improvement of crop growth with more organic matter in soil is indeed nutrient retention. That nitrogen, phosphorus, and all kinds of other nutrients are better retained in the soil that has more organic matter. And biochar is no exception. However, in addition to that, biochar is organic matter that acts very much like organic matter in what I just said. It persists 10, 100 times longer than other organic matter. And it turns out, when it comes to nutrient retention, is more effective per unit carbon than any other amendment that you can think of. So it's something like a magnet or so. If you put a poor magnet in the soil and retain some nutrients, biochar is somewhat of a very effective magnet that retains cations much better than any other organic matter that you can put into the soil. And in most cases, it has a greater surface area. So that together makes it a superb absorber for nutrients and thereby increasing nutrient use efficiency. Water retention is another aspect of organic matter that is very important and seems on a global scale also to improve crop growth quite a bit. Question is whether it is economically feasible to produce so much biochar that you can actually increase soil organic matter to an extent that it would improve water holding capacity. That is a question of return on investment and how much it costs to make that. So those are clearly different questions.
A friend told me that she's having trouble with her backyard. She's not even going to try to raise vegetables this year because they're not doing well. But I said, well, I want you to experiment for me. So I'm going to get some biochar for you. And so I began shopping. And there's no place around where you can buy biochar, not in Toronto or even the vicinity. And I finally sent off to New York State. Maybe it's some of the biochar you've made someplace, who knows, and bought a bag of, like, I don't know, 5 cubic feet of biochar for her. Well, I don't know that she's even used it, or at least I don't hear any glowing reports about how much better her vegetables are this year. But I think the problem that is puzzling me is, obviously, biochar is good most of the time. Maybe we need to talk further about when it's not good, when maybe it could be detrimental. But if it's mostly good, why is it you can't even buy the darn stuff? Why isn't there a market for it? What can we do to create a market for it?
Oh, yeah, those are very good questions. And one reason, of course, there's just inertia in the system. Most people don't even know how to spell biochar, have never heard about it. So there's no consumer demand. So why should there be a company that sells it if nobody wants to buy it or has even heard about it? So the market pull needs to be developed. And I don't know whether it's fair to give the analogy, but there were large-scale wind energy in the 50s, and photovoltaics were definitely existing in the 70s. But it took another 50, 60, 70 years until we have photovoltaics on many roofs in Ithaca, and we still have not a single wind energy plant around Ithaca anywhere because of hurdles of regulations and NIMBYism. So it just takes a long time. Electric cars are another story. So it can take. We've been looking at this hard only for about 10, 15 years. So that's a relatively recent development. The companies that are sticking their neck out and starting to offer biochar products are facing, of course, largely a consumer pool that has never heard about the product, and so it's a very steep a steep hurdle to climb that. But I hope some Canadian companies are listening in on your program, because there are some notable Canadian companies even in your area, or well, when I say area, I mean globally seen area. I'm not sure that they're in Toronto, but they produce biochar for all kinds of applications, and it should be easier than what you describe to find them and get their products. But I believe you. It's probably not as easy as it should be, and that's a big problem for now. It is very different from 10 years ago. The first products that anybody offered online were only 7-8 years ago. 2011, 12, 13 is when the first products were marketed at all. So nowadays, if you go on the major platforms, you punch in biochar, you at least you get a range of products that you can click on and buy with a credit card and get it delivered to your home. But it's still difficult to go into a local garden shop and find a biochar product there, and most of them don't have it.
Yeah, I searched on Google. I couldn't even find any local, outlets for it. So, yeah. So there, I just, given the fact that there are thousands of people, millions of people now who really want to do what they can for climate change issues, and they'll do all kinds of things like becoming vegan or something. But I would think that they would be very happy to. Oh, by the way, maybe this is what I almost bought. I saw an ad for something that isn't even available yet, but it's something you put on your counter in the kitchen, and you put your food in it, and it's going to do something to it. It doesn't say that it makes biochar, but what it does sounds to me like what it's doing is making biochar out of your garbage. Is there such a thing about to be developed? Because it said you can sign up to get one when they're ready, but they're not even. And
they're ready. Oh,
they haven't even made it yet.
I have no idea, but roasting coffee is not so dissimilar to making biochar, right? So and there are people who make a roasting coffee at home. So that's making biochar more or less. You're heating coffee beans, and you don't want them to burn. You want them to become black. Now, you could argue that's more torrefaction, so it's just below biochar making. It's not really making charcoal. It's making on the way to charcoal. But the green coffee beans become quite black in some instances, and so the technology on the kitchen counter can be an impossibility to conceptualize if in principle the gadget already exists.
It sounds like a really practical thing that people could buy and put on their counter and then make biochar. I would love to see that happen. So, but now I talked to a friend who was once a big enthusiast promoting biochar, and he said, no, that you can make biochar that's bad, that there are ways in which it can be, you can make poisonous biochar, you can make something that it has deleterious effects. Is that the case? Is there anything that we have to watch out for?
Yes, absolutely. You can make, well, I should say, you can make biochar that's inappropriate for some uses. And maybe for most uses, but probably only for some uses. It's similar to taking water and putting more water than you need to on your potted plants, and you kill your plants with water. That doesn't mean that water is in principle bad for plants. In fact, plants need water. You can also put too much nitrogen onto a plant or too little. That doesn't mean that plants don't need nitrogen or that they don't want nitrogen. You just put the wrong amount on.
Yeah.
You can put lime on a soil. And if the soil is a calcareous soil, then probably your plants will die. That doesn't mean that lime on an acid soil wouldn't be exactly what you should be doing. So I wouldn't say necessarily in the most cases where you shouldn't use a certain biochar on a certain soil, that it's because the biochar is poisonous. It might just not be appropriate for that intended use. Mm-hmm. That said, I'm sure I can make a biochar that you should never use, maybe from material that has so much arsenic in it that also the biochar has so much arsenic in it that you should not be using it anywhere. But then you probably also have a problem with the wood that the uncharred wood that has arsenic in it. And I'm sure I can make some biochar that is under most soil conditions not a great soil amendment. Okay, but then it might be a good road filler or a good or good in the barbecue. Then you just use it for another material. So you still need to figure out, what do I want to fix? What do I want to use it for? And then you produce a product for that use. And you still need to convince yourself and your clients, if you sell it, that this is actually delivering on the purpose that you made it for. They just say blanket, I make biochar and it's good for everything on every location in any use is pretty harebrained.
Can you make a biochar that is already for sure not harmful anywhere?
I don't think so. As with water, if you put if you put too much water on your potted plant, you kill it.
Okay, but look, I mean, that's the worst argument of all, because it means that you've got to tell people then you have to know what you're doing to use this stuff, because it could be bad.
As with watering. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, yes,
absolutely.
But I mean, when I buy peat moss or something to use for my potted plants, I don't get it with a warning of be careful not to use it under certain circumstances. You need to be very sophisticated to know where to use this. No, it's just generally, it's assumed that most of the time it's okay. Don't worry about it and try to use it however you want. And if you tell me that I'm going to have to become very, very smart before I should buy any biochar to use in my garden, if I had one, which I don't because I live in a high rise. But if I were going to be a gardener, that I shouldn't just go out and buy biochar and put it down because it might do damage. That's very bad for building a market. I'm trying to think of how we can get more and more people to using biochar. And you just poured cold water all over the whole thing.
No, I don't think so. No, it's you need to read the label. If you buy plant food and you don't read the label and you put the whole bag of plant food onto your potted plant, it will die. If you don't read the label of your aspirin and you take the whole package, if you have a headache, you probably also die. You need to read the label. And the person who sells you the biochar needs to make a label that says you use this biochar as prescribed for the use intended. And if you don't read the label and you eat the whole package of aspirin, not a good idea. That still doesn't mean you shouldn't buy aspirin.
Yeah. Okay. All right. I'll excuse you for this downer. I don't want to end the show with a downer, but this has been extremely, very, very, very helpful and very useful. I thank you so much, and I hope your projects have endless success. That you're doing all the good things. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mida, for your conversation.
Okay. Bye.
Bye-bye.